This is One Talk Show. One Talk Show is a weekly program focusing on the best of Oromia, the life skills, experiences, and the struggles of immigrants in their host culture and back home between Horn of Africa and the United States. Today we have a special edition of One Talk. Our special guest today is Ambassador David Shinn, who is a veteran diplomat of the United States who served in Ethiopia as an ambassador from 1996 to 1999. It's a profound privilege to have him on my show. Ambassador Shinn is currently adjunct professor of international relations at George Washington University. I'm so excited that he accepted my invitation to have conversation on Oromo, Ethiopia, and the Horn of Africa issues, current issues, and his past expertise on politics of the Horn, and he's willing to share with us his expertise. And welcome, Ambassador Shinn, on behalf of myself, the host of the One Talk, and to start with and to tell my audiences in 4 E's briefly in your early childhood, education, experience, and your current engagement. Again, welcome.
Thank you very much for having me on your program today. And as far as my own background is concerned, I spent 37 years in the U.S. Department of State, the Foreign Service, serving predominantly in Africa. In fact, all of my assignments, except for one in Lebanon, were in Africa or had something to do with Africa working in Washington. I retired in the year 2000 and have been teaching at George Washington University ever since, primarily African affairs, and continue to remain engaged in African issues, normally visit the continent once a year, probably get back to Ethiopia every other year. It's been about 2 years now since I was last in Ethiopia, but get back fairly regularly and try to keep up with events there. So I stay engaged with Africa generally and the Horn of Africa in particular.
Great, thank you. To start with our conversations, what is your reflection on current situation in Tigray, Oromia, and Ethiopia in general?
I think the country's in a very troubling period at the moment. Perhaps the most troubled since I have been affiliated with Ethiopia, which actually dates back to 1969, when I was the assistant desk officer in the State Department for Ethiopia, and at the same time the desk officer for Somalia and Djibouti. So I've followed Ethiopian politics and events, not continuously, but sporadically ever since. And there have been a number of occasions when the situation has been very difficult in Ethiopia. There's no doubt about that. The overthrow of Haile Selassie in 1974 and the Mengistu government, which was a very difficult period, particularly for relations with the United States. Then the arrival of the EPRDF in 1991, a time that also had its problems. The war with Eritrea in 1998, which also presented another major problem for relations with the United States. So Ethiopia has gone through even in recent history, a long period of difficulties. But I think the current situation in many ways is more worrisome because it is relatively widespread in the country. The current focus is predominantly on Tigray, primarily because the humanitarian crisis is greater in Tigray than it is anywhere else in the country. But the problems go beyond Tigray, and they tend to be ethnic based, which makes it more worrisome because ethnic problems are very hard to resolve. They tend to have very deep roots, long histories, and they're not the kinds of things that can be solved quickly. Ethiopia, I think, had a better way, or at least a more effective way, of dealing with ethnic problems in the past, but in a sense it was covering them up. If you go back into the imperial history of Ethiopia, the problems were all there. They're not new. But the authoritarian model of government during the imperial regime made it possible to, in effect, to cover up the problems. As Ethiopia has become somewhat more democratic and in more recent decades, it's much harder to cover the problems up. They tend to come to the surface, and we're certainly seeing that today. And particularly in the case of Tigray, where the situation has become exceedingly difficult. But it's also expressing itself in Oromia and Benishangul. We've seen it earlier in Somali region and Afar region, although those regions are relatively quiet at the moment compared to some of the rest of Ethiopia. But I find the current situation to be a very deep concern, and I worry about the future of Ethiopia. The only sort of good news story that I can take out of it is if you look at Ethiopian history over the millennia, it has gone through a number of periods of deep stress, enormous tension, huge challenge to governance, and it has survived, maybe with a lot of death and destruction in the process, but it nevertheless has survived. So I'm hopeful that it will survive the current episode. I happen to be someone who believes in the territorial integrity of Ethiopia. I would not like to see the balkanization of the country. And I think there are some today who would like to have balkanization, a breakup of the country. I think that would be a huge mistake. It might offer some short-term solutions, but it would offer far more long-term problems. So I'm hopeful it will not come to that. My own view is that it will not, but there's real stress on the country today. And that concerns me enormously. And of course, there are a lot of individual Ethiopians who are suffering tremendously as a result of the current situation. And I feel for them that they have to go through the suffering that they're experiencing today.
Thank you. Probably we might raise some points down the road. And there is an opinion out there that U.S. foreign policy actors gave a favor to TPLF when they came to control the state power in 1991. Specifically, they marginalized the Oromos and the wider South. And this didn't materialize the current federal system or the power share decentralization. And do you think the opinion that the United States gave a favor toward the TPLF over other organizations, political organizations, in the last decades, since 1991 up to 3 years ago? And people like you, Ambassador Cohen, Secretary Kerry, have wider engagement with Ethiopian government in the past. So do you agree with this, that the United States gave a favor policy towards TPLF in the past?
Sure. No, I'll be happy to answer that question. But in order to do it, I need to give a little bit of background as to how American foreign policy works. It is not perhaps as personalized as you imply with your question, and I will focus primarily on my own engagement with Ethiopia during the 1996 to 99 period. I can obviously speak more authoritatively for myself than I can for people like Ambassador Cohen or John Kerry or others. And it's important to understand how U.S. policy works. Keep in mind that the EPRDF came into power in 1991. Now, I would be the first to acknowledge that the TPLF held preponderant power in the EPRDF, but technically it was the EPRDF that was ruling the country at the time. And with the EPRDF, you had a coalition government, including one of the Oromo parties. The OPDO represented the Oromo component at that time. But I grant you that the TPLF clearly had predominant power. The way that the American government functions with any government, including in this case Ethiopia, with which it has cordial diplomatic relations, it obviously interacts with the government in power, in this case the EPRDF. And so long as it has made the decision in Washington that it wants to have cordial relations with that government, it is going to take the necessary steps to try to encourage those good relations, even in spite of some of the problems that those governments may raise. And there clearly were some problems in the EPRDF. But so long as the EPRDF wanted to work with the United States, did some things that the United States liked. For example, Ethiopia was very supportive of regional peacekeeping throughout the 1990s, including the time that I was there. That was a key part of American policy in the region, in the wider region of the Horn of Africa. And so long as Ethiopia was making positive contributions to regional peacekeeping efforts, the U.S. wanted to be supportive of Ethiopia. Ethiopia was also helpful, particularly later, more so after I left than when I was there, in terms of combating terrorism in the region. Terrorism problem became more serious after 9/11. I was gone by that time. But it had already started prior to my departure, particularly terrorism that was coming out of Sudan at the time. And Ethiopia took a very strong position supporting the American effort to combat anything coming out of Sudan in the 1990s that was seen as either Islamic fundamentalism or terrorism. So the United States is weighing what its interests are, what it gets out of a particular country, in this case the Ethiopia or the EPRDF, which is in power, and incidentally the TPLF, which is the key player in the EPRDF. And as ambassador there, I'm the person who is expected to carry that out. And if I, for some reason, disagree vehemently with whatever U.S. policy is, I obviously always have the choice of resigning and leaving. I did not disagree violently with U.S. policy. I was perfectly prepared to carry out U.S. policy. There were occasions when I would express my concerns about the way we were proceeding, but they did not rise to the level of objecting fundamentally to American policy. There were issues that I was perhaps more concerned about than Washington was concerned about. So I can fully understand why it would appear to persons who are not part of the EPRDF or the TPLF, why it looked like the United States was very supportive, or why perhaps I personally was supportive of the EPRDF or the TPLF. That was American policy. That's the way foreign policy works. And I could make the same argument for most countries around the world. The exceptions would be a country like Cuba or North Korea, where we have very bad relations or no relation at all. And there we actually work against, oftentimes, the host government. But with 95% of the countries around the world, they're like Ethiopia, where we have cordial relations and we try to work with those governments. Now, that's a long way of, I guess, defending my own position on this. But that's the way it is. And your viewers may disagree with me, and they're certainly welcome to do that. But if they ever get into government, particularly the American government, they're going to find that that's the way one operates. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, I was about to ask you, and you already answered it. And does it in conflict with American ideal principle of democracy, human rights, promoting around the world when the foreign policy? I know the American foreign policy is based on American national interest or core interest, but you already answered. But my concern is when American foreign policy deals with repressive regimes like the past, it can be the Sudan, Ethiopia, Egypt, or any other states, and does it that conflict, and how we can reconcile that?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and I'm glad you raised that. And let me answer it in the context specifically of Ethiopia, although I could make a similar response for other countries that I'm familiar with, like Sudan or Egypt or Eritrea or whatever. There often is a conflict here. And during my time in Ethiopia, this was in conflict. Now, if you go back and you look at the State Department Human Rights Report for Ethiopia during the years that I served there, it was quite frank, maybe not as frank as the Oromo community would like it to have been, but nevertheless, it was quite frank. And it spelled out a lot of the concerns that I think the Oromo community had, and with sometimes surprising detail. And that report each year always caused an enormous amount of consternation in the leadership of the EPRDF. Whenever that report was publicly released in Washington, I would usually be summoned by someone in the EPRDF, sort of pounding on the table saying, "Why did you say this? This is all wrong, and we disagree with this," et cetera, et cetera. And, I just have to sit there and take it because we simply had a different view of many of the human rights situations. But where you really run into a problem here is that report will often come in direct conflict with other American interests in Ethiopia, like Ethiopian support for counterterrorism, Ethiopian support for regional peacekeeping operations. And then you get this situation where you're weighing one side against the other. And you know what usually wins out in those arguments? Well, it's Ethiopian support for counterterrorism and regional peacekeeping operations normally trumps the human rights side of the concerns. And this was true during my time, and it has been true in subsequent years right up to the present.
Thank you. My next question is it's about current situation of Ethiopia. Lying, fake news, and alternative facts are the current behavior of Ethiopian regime. This is a challenge to building democracy, as you know. What are your reflections on that?
You're asking that question at a very difficult time for an American to respond after 4 years of fake news in the United States. Uh, I hardly should be criticizing another country, I suppose. It seems like fake news is becoming the norm rather than the exception around the world, and I find it terribly destructive. I found it destructive in the United States. Uh, when it exists, when it existed here, and occasionally still does. Fake news has never disappeared from the United States. It's just that it was a lot worse over the last 4 years than it has ever been in my lifetime. But you're right. We are seeing news coming out of Ethiopia that is of great concern, and in some cases just not accurate. A classic example would be the denials coming from the government of Ethiopia for several months that there were no Eritrean troops in Tigray. Categorical denials. There are no Eritrean troops in Tigray. Well, now that everyone has seen them running around Tigray, and it's pretty obvious that they were there and maybe are still there today, the government has had to change its position on that and say, well, yeah, there were Eritrean troops in Tigray. We didn't invite them, but they're there. And that's the sort of thing that you lose credibility on. Why are your own citizens going to believe you in the future when you deny something that is so obvious to virtually everyone in the country and outside the country? So this is a very dangerous game to play. Ethiopia is simply one of the many countries in the world that has been playing that game, and unfortunately, I have to include the United States in that game too. But this is dangerous, and if you want to lose credibility with your own population, you continue to do that. In a democracy, you have to have transparency and you have to have honesty. If you don't have that, you basically don't have a democracy.
Thank you. Currently, the Ethiopian, as a country, there are three different forces. Any observer of Ethiopia can understand that the right-wing Amara elites want to dismantle ethnic federalism. And there are other groups, the left-wing liberation fronts, who ask for self-determination. And there are people in between these two groups, to the right wing and left wing, and then the centrists. How do we reconcile in building democracy, holding free election, and how we decentralize power and such two extreme contradictory ideas?
Well, you're of course asking the $1 million question of the day. That is the question that I think many Ethiopians are searching for. They're searching for the answer to that question. I'm not sure I have the answer for it. I will try to respond to your question, but I'm not sure I have a brilliant answer for it. But I would also even suggest that the situation may be more complicated than you're proposing. You're talking about three different factions or three different understandings about how to go forward. I think it may be more than that. And if you bring into the equation, for example, a combination of not just political ideology, but also things like religion and the differences that I suspect will become more prominent in the divisions of Ethiopia's different religions in the country. I think this plays out throughout the country, certainly in Oromia, where you have very prominent segments of the population that are Ethiopian Orthodox, are evangelical, and are Muslim. And they're all very important elements in Oromia, which really complicates just the situation in Oromia alone. Then you extrapolate this to other parts of Ethiopia and the different ethnic groups, the some 85 different ethnic groups, it really gets complex. So I'm not sure it's as simple as you suggest. The only solution that I can come up with, and it's not a brilliant solution, and it certainly is not original because so many others have been talking about it recently. But I really think there has to be some kind of national dialogue in the country where all the major components of Ethiopian society are somehow represented. And that's very hard to do because there are so many different components of Ethiopian society. But there just has to be some kind of a national discussion about moving forward. And I don't know how that would come out. I mean, that's for Ethiopians to decide, not outsiders. But until you have that discussion, which is frank and open, and where there's a willingness to compromise, and goodness knows, my experience has been Ethiopians are not very easy to compromise. That is not their strength. I found it very hard to get Ethiopian groups to compromise on almost anything. But you really have to have that in order to have a successful national dialogue. And then there has to be some kind of a consensus, and not everyone's going to agree. Certainly, everyone's not going to get all that they want. They're only going to get some of what they want. And if they decide to go forward with some form of ethnic federalism or some form of more centralized rule, that's up to Ethiopians to decide. And I have no idea where they will come out on that. But I don't know any other way to move forward than to go down that path. To make arbitrary decisions from on high is not going to solve it. And that I do know. And to make decisions from various regions that apply only to that region will not solve it, because that, I think, will result in balkanization of the country.
Thank you, Ambassador. U.S. ambassadors, diplomats around the world, they serve their country with honesty, integrity, and with the highest principles of service. And currently, I think it's last month or a month before, I saw on Ethiopian media that they are accusing U.S. diplomats who serve at United Nations level or as country ambassadors. And I saw one news about Ambassador Susan Rice accusing her of being a millionaire. And I know the U.S. State Department trains these diplomats with highest moral ground and with principles. And how do you respond to that, these baseless accusations of the former ambassadors who served in Ethiopia or somewhere? If they are against that repressive regime, they start, accusations of these people. It is part of the fake news, and lying became state behavior or government behavior currently.
Yes, this is a hard one, and quite frankly, I don't think there's any solution to that problem. It basically goes with the territory. In other words, if you serve in these positions that have a lot of public exposure, where you're constantly in front of the media, where you're open to criticism, you're going to get criticism. If you say things that you believe to be true, that people disagree with you and they don't like what you say, they can say whatever they want about you. I have no doubt I will be criticized somewhere in the Ethiopian diaspora after this program is over for something I have said on it. I think it's inevitable that will happen. It usually does. Whenever I get on an Ethiopian radio or television program, there's always a group out there that doesn't like what I say, and I get criticized for it. So the only way to avoid that is to not get on programs like this and to hide. But that's not my answer to the problem. I like to think that I still have something useful to offer in terms of either historical advice or maybe even current advice. And if there are still people who are interested in listening to me, I'm willing to speak on the topic. But I don't know any solution to that problem. You just have to be thick-skinned and to accept the criticism, knowing that it's going to come. And I find that it's particularly true with the Ethiopian community. They're very quick to criticize, more so than I think any other African government or African community that I have dealt with. I've served in Sudan, Kenya, Tanzania, Chad, Cameroon, Mauritania, and I never quite experienced the kinds of criticisms with those communities that I have in the case of Ethiopia. Now, part of that is a question of visibility. Obviously, when you're ambassador, you're more visible than if you're a junior political officer in Kenya. But it is interesting that it's a particular problem in interacting with the Ethiopian community, and particularly the Ethiopian diaspora.
It's great. Thank you. And my next question is, if you are reassigned as an ambassador back to Ethiopia today, what would you do differently? And what is your major accomplishments as an ambassador during your tenure in Ethiopia and the last?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think in terms of what I would do, well, first off, let me predicate your question with, at age 80, there's no way I'm going to return to Ethiopia as ambassador, so no one needs to worry about that, or any other country for that matter. But hypothetically, if something like that were to happen, it's a perfectly legitimate question and a good one. And there are probably some things that I would do differently. I'll only select one, so I don't embarrass myself more than I have to with that question. But I think the one area where we failed ourselves and did not do as well as we could have or should have was in calling out the EPRDF, and you will notice I use the term EPRDF rather than TPLF, but I feel very strongly that was the government we were dealing with at the time. But I think we did not sufficiently call out the EPRDF on the numbers of political detentions and political arrests that existed in Ethiopia during my period there from 96 to 99, but also in the period that preceded me, which I suppose indirectly I could be criticized for, because at the time I was director for East African Affairs at the State Department, so I had responsibility for Ethiopia in Washington, although I was not serving in Ethiopia. And also in the period after I left, I think the same problem continued, where there were significant numbers of Ethiopians, many of them Oromo, in fact, probably most of them Oromo, were in detention or were under arrest, some significantly abused. And our human rights report did regularly make reference to these cases. And we would sometimes go to the government and call out certain high-profile cases that we had information on, although not very often, but we would do it. But there were a lot of other people out there whom we did not know. I mean, they were not known to the embassy. We didn't have names. They weren't well-known people. But we didn't say enough about that to the government. Now, I'm not suggesting that the government would have done anything about it, even if we had. But with the benefit of hindsight, we should have been more outspoken on those kinds of cases, going all the way back to 1991. And this is obviously a problem that predated the EPRDF. It was a huge problem during the Mengistu Haile Mariam government also, but we had a terrible relationship with that government, so we had no leverage with them anyway. But in the case of the EPRDF, we did have some leverage, and we didn't do enough on that score. During my time, we were fairly outspoken in terms of press freedom, and we did regularly raise that issue with the government of Ethiopia. Not with any particular success, but nevertheless, we raised it. We also were fairly outspoken about supporting non-governmental organizations in Ethiopia, and we did have a little success there. But on political prisoners, we didn't have success, and we didn't try very hard. And if I were to do it all over again, I would spend more time on that. The second part of your question was, what was I engaged in that I was proud of or thought we did very well? And there is an event that, and I've related this story in other fora with other Ethiopian groups, because I think it is an important lesson, and it is one that I'm very proud of. If you go back to 1998, in May, the month of May, in the outbreak of war with Eritrea, that situation totally changed, at least over the next year or so, the U.S. relationship with Ethiopia and with Eritrea. It made U.S. relations much more difficult with both countries because both Isaias and Eritrea and Meles and Ethiopia perceived that the United States was supporting the other side. In other words, Meles thought we were being too supportive of Eritrea, and Isaias thought we were being too supportive of Ethiopia. And they simply could not appreciate that the United States was trying to balance its policy between Ethiopia and Eritrea. We had good relations at the time with both Ethiopia and Eritrea, and we were trying to balance that relationship. Well, that doesn't work very well with Ethiopians or Eritreans. Their view was you're either for us or you're against us. None of this middle ground stuff, none of this balancing business. We think you should either support us or not. And the Ethiopians felt particularly strongly about that because they felt they were the aggrieved party because the Eritrean army initially crossed into Badame in Tigray region, and therefore that the United States should have condemned that intervention much more forcefully than it did. The point here is that this totally changed the Ethiopia-U.S. relationship. It made my job much more difficult within a matter of days. It was just harder to do anything in the country. My contacts with the government became far more difficult, far less pleasant, and it was just hard. And I could see this was going to go on for quite some time because that war was not going to end quickly. So I made a decision that, okay, if I can't be very effective on political issues any longer with the government of Ethiopia, I've got to do something with my time that will be useful to Ethiopia. Otherwise, I'm wasting my time in the country. I might as well go home. And I looked around trying to find an issue where I could have an impact and decided that that issue would be trying to help combat the HIV/AIDS epidemic in the country. If you think back on the late 1990s, HIV/AIDS was starting to overwhelm Ethiopia. Now, it was not being given proper attention by the government or by anyone other than a handful of non-governmental organizations. The Ministry of Health was not doing much about it. No one was really doing much about it. And yet we could see from the embassy point of view that this was going to devastate the country if somebody didn't step in and try to make a major effort to roll it back. And I made the decision at that point that that the American Embassy and USAID would try to play that role. So it was an all hands on effort to, one, convince the government of Ethiopia that they had a serious problem here and they had to do something about it. And more importantly, the United States was willing to help in a major way to do something about it. Now, as it happened, we got lucky in the sense that USAID had some money to put into combating HIV/AIDS. It had expertise. It was spending a lot of effort compiling data on HIV/AIDS throughout the world, including Africa, including Ethiopia. It had identified Ethiopia as one of the most threatened countries in the world, and it was willing to help out with money and resources and expertise, sending experts to Ethiopia and doing whatever was necessary. So I started the whole effort by going to Negasso Jadada, who was then the president of Ethiopia. And you know how the presidency works in Ethiopia. It's more of a sinecure. It doesn't have a lot of power. It has a nice title, a nice place to live, but not much power. And I had gotten to know Negasso very well, and I had a lot of respect for Negasso and still do. So I started with him, and I said, look, Mr. President, you've got some time on your hands. You're not that busy, and you've got a serious problem in this country of combating HIV/AIDS. Let us give you a briefing on the problem, and I want to encourage you to take this on as a personal issue throughout Ethiopia. And you can become sort of the leader, as it were, of combating HIV/AIDS in Ethiopia. Well, he jumped on the idea. He thought this was a terrific idea. And he did. But I didn't stop there. I then went to the patriarch of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, Abuna Paulos, made the same pitch to him and said, USAID will come up with some resources to help elements of the church emphasize, to propagate to your followers the problem that HIV/AIDS is causing, and you need to take it seriously. You need to do something about it. He thought it was a good idea, and he jumped on the effort also. Well, at this point, I felt I was on a roll. I then went to the leaders of the evangelical communities, Makani Jesus, Hiwat, and made the same pitch to them. They thought it was a good idea. They got involved. And finally, I decided, well, even though we don't have very great relations with the Supreme Islamic Council and Ethiopia, we'll even try them. I went to the Supreme Islamic Council, and they thought it was a good idea. So all of the religious community was on board with this. The several non-governmental organizations were already engaged. They were very supportive. And with a combination of President Negasso, all the religious groups, the non-governmental organizations, USAID, and then eventually bringing other donors into it, mainly European donors, and particularly after, at this point, I left in 1999, and this was an ongoing program. So most of the money started rolling in after I left, but it began during my time there, and the whole Ethiopian part of the effort began while I was there. And I like to take a little bit of credit for getting that ball rolling, or at least planting the idea that this had to be dealt with. And the outcome has been dramatic. Ethiopia has basically corralled the problem of HIV/AIDS. It's still an issue. It's still there. Hasn't gone away. But Ethiopia was on the verge of being overwhelmed by HIV/AIDS back in the late 1990s. And today it's kind of an afterthought almost. And now it's COVID-19. That's the problem, not HIV/AIDS.
Thank you. I really appreciate that, and thank you for your service. And one of Africa is grateful to George Bush the 43rd would be about his policy funding the HIV programs in Africa and specifically in Ethiopia. And I have first-hand information and experience with that. And I was around there in 1999. And the HIV pandemic was really it's a national threat by that time. And the funding from USAID and from the US government has helped that. My other question is, I just went through your Twitter and Ambassador Cohen's Twitter page and see some reflections on Ethiopia. And I see from your resume too, you are very engaged publishing articles on Ethiopia, on Africa-China relations, and currently veteran diplomats, you, Ambassador Cohen and others who served in Ethiopia, is there any willingness to come together and write a resolve letter to Department of State or to US government? I know veteran diplomats have influence on American foreign policy, so the Biden administration can get clear picture of Ethiopia and how this multi-ethnic, multinational country can move forward towards peace and democracy.
Sure. Actually, I've already done that. Well over a month ago, 4 former ambassadors, myself included, did an open letter to Abiy Ahmed that was published in The Reporter in Addis Ababa, which laid out our concerns as of that point in time. That was more than a month ago. We subsequently, 5 of us, 5 former ambassadors, we were then joined by Tibor Nagy, who had then left the Trump administration. Therefore, he could join us as a signatory. And we did what we call an op-ed or an editorial piece that was published in allafrica.com on essentially the same kinds of issues, but more current. That was several weeks ago. And then most recently, I have signed on to a letter involving a much larger group of us in Washington who are simply interested in Ethiopia. I think I'm the only former ambassador who signed on, but the others are all very knowledgeable about Ethiopia. And that was a private letter to Secretary of State Blinken, and that is not a public letter, but it covered many of the same issues. It got into a few more issues than the open letters did. So I've been fairly active in that regard, and I'm sure made myself unpopular in certain quarters as a result of doing that. But the letters, the comments, we've tried to be balanced. The focus, as you might imagine, has been primarily on Tigray, because that's where the largest immediate humanitarian crisis is. But we also mentioned concerns about political arrests in the country today. And it's pretty obvious who we're speaking about there. So these are comments that are not going to go down well with the government.
Thank you. I have personal questions for you. What is your most memorable event or time you remember Ethiopia for?
Yeah, I'm pleased that you gave me a heads up about that question, because that's the kind of question you really have to think about. There are so many things that come to mind. Trying to identify any single item is sometimes very difficult. But that, as a result, I have posted a map of Ethiopia behind me. I'm going to back out of the way here. I don't know whether, can you see that at all on your screen, that map?
Yes.
This is a map that I maintained during the years 1996 to 1999. And all of the dark lines that you see on the map, the real heavy black lines, those are places that I traveled by road in Ethiopia at least once. Now, on many of those black lines, I traveled many times. Now, you can see some of the black lines don't even show up very well. For example, you get out here into the far end of Oromia, the line doesn't show up very well. But you can see those black lines cover virtually the entire country except for this part of Somali region. And even in this area here, I flew into Gode at one point, so I even got into the center of Somali region. But I show this map to underscore that I did travel in every nook and cranny, almost, of Ethiopia. At that time, there were 63 zones in Ethiopia. I visited the zonal capitals of 58 of the 63, and the only 5 zonal capitals I did not visit were 5 in Somali region because the government wouldn't let me go there. If you think back in the 1996 to 98 period, there were a lot of security problems in Somali region, and the government was not allowing travel for foreigners anyway, in most of Somali region. So at one point, for example, I was literally driving on my way to Feek, and I was stopped by security forces before I got to Feek, saying, "No, Mr. Ambassador, we can't allow you to go here because we're afraid there might be an explosive device on the road or something." So they turned me around and sent me back to probably Jigjiga. I guess I was overnighting in Jigjiga at that point. The point is that my strongest recollections of Ethiopia are all of these travels collectively in all parts of the country, and certainly throughout all of Oromia. There's hardly a road of any significance in Oromia that I was not on at one point or another. And I think that is the glory of Ethiopia. It's the multi-ethnicity of the country. It's the beauty of the country. It's the diversity of the country. And it's in part why I feel so strongly that it needs to stay a united Ethiopia rather than one that breaks up into a whole bunch of different little landlocked countries, some of which would never be an economic success. I mean, conceivably, you could have a successful Oromia because it's very large, but there would be parts of Ethiopia that would be economic disasters if they were totally independent. So that, to me, is the most vivid memory that I have of the country. My wife would often join me on these trips. Sometimes my 2 sons would be visiting from the United States. They would join me on some of the trips when they were in Ethiopia. Whenever I made these visits, I would take a team from the embassy, and we would always meet with not only the local officials in the zonal capitals, we would meet with the local business community, we would meet with religious leaders, we would meet, if we could, with any opposition political representatives that were in that particular area. We would meet with the local press, if there was any local press. I would do radio interviews in the larger towns. The whole effort was to try to show that the United States is interested in every part of Ethiopia. And in my view, that was the most effective way to do it. And it's also one of the things I'm proudest of for having done that. I had a policy while serving in Ethiopia that 1 week out of every month I would be outside of Addis Ababa. And I held to that for more than 3 years. On average, I was not in Addis Ababa for 1 week out of every month because I was traveling somewhere in the country. So some of these locations I might have visited 5 or 6 different times over the course of 3 years. Some of the more isolated ones perhaps only visited once. I went to Dolo once, and I went to Gode once. And there were Gambella. I was probably there 3 times. In the Beni Shangul area, I was up there 2 or 3 times. But some of the areas closer to Addis Ababa, I was there many times.
It's great, thank you. It's extensive travel, I can say. And before we conclude our conversations today, I want this phrase to bring into Ethiopian political discourse. Probably I am asking your opinion, not an expertise on this. And there is a phrase called, currently I discovered in grounded theory, it's called defensive disattending. It is a theory of social interaction of denials. In Ethiopian political discourse, Oromo versus others, the Amara or the ruling regime for 150 years, there is a politics of denial that massacres or repression, operation was not happened. And how do we bring this into the political discourse and recognize what has happened? Even it's here in the United States, there are people who are doing defensive disattending that slavery was not happened or climate change is not real. And this is a concept of denying what has happened in the past. So how do we overcome this, acknowledge the past, and then move forward? Just your reflections.
Well, it's obviously easier to deal with an issue like this at sort of the academic level than it is at the governmental level. And I think it would not be that difficult, and even to bring in some outside expertise, people who have done this kind of thing in other countries. Doesn't have to be the United States, it might be from some other country, who can lead an effort like that, either through the academic community or the non-governmental organization community. The problem is that it may not have much impact when it's done at that level. And if it would have far more impact if it were done at the governmental level. But if the government's not willing to do it, then obviously it's not going to happen. So there has to be a willingness by the government to engage in that kind of an effort. And that's the hard part. I don't know how, I don't have an answer to that question. I don't know how you convince any government, whether it's the EPRDF or the Prosperity Party or the Oromo Liberation Front or any governing regime, how you can convince them to do that kind of thing. So I guess the best idea I can suggest is that you start at the non-governmental organization level or the academic level and hope that it catches on with someone in leadership and government and that they will pursue it and make it maybe part of a national dialogue. But that's not a great answer to the question, but there may not be a good answer to that question.
Thank you. And finally, if you have any message for the Oromo people, and if you know some words from Afan Oromo, please share with us before we conclude our conversation.
Well, you've given me some help on this, and I guess I would say thank you for including me on this interview, or Galatuma, or I understand that the singular is Galatumi, and I'm not sure I know the difference between the singular and the plural. Maybe you could tell me why do you have a singular and a plural for thank you?
It's a way of it's a dignified way of somebody. This is a specialist. Only in Ethiopia you call somebody isin, or you use a plural you. So that's why Galatoma, it can be plural or it's for an individual, as if you are older or senior in the community, you call them isin. That means okay. You, the plural.
That explains it.
Yep. Again, thank you, Ambassador David Shinn, and I will reach out. This is the beginning, and I will reach out when I am looking for reflection on any diplomatic or international affairs of the Horn of Africa, in Ethiopia-China relations or Africa relations. And it's a profound privilege to have you again on my show, and thank you very much for your time and expertise. Thank you for your service too.
Galatuma.
This is the end of the special edition of One Talk. Thank you for watching. See you next time.